Hi there, Scott here, founder and chief strategist at Innate Strategies and the source for Emergent Impact. I wanted to share this particular project with you because it's one of the more complex projects Emergent Impact has been applied to. And though my maxim is to keep things as simple as possible, but no simpler, which is a fairly common maxim, in this case, that is still fairly complicated. So I wanted to show you how, a couple of things. One, how it can be applied to a highly complex project. This is, by the way, I've done it in highly complex projects in the private sector. For example, a $30 billion, 66,000 person legacy tech company trying to pivot in the face of Google and Amazon. This is one in the public sector where I can share it with you because it's publicly known. So I wanted you to understand how the complexity can be handled. But secondly, I wanted to share with you just how startling the number one leverage point in the whole system was, and how we never would have gotten to it had we not approached it in this way. And yet, once you see it, it's kind of a duh. You suddenly realize how commonsensical it is, and you'll see why we never would have gotten to it had we not gone about it in this way. So let me move on with this story. First of all, I want you to know that this way of working has been applied across a broad variety of issues, cultures, industries, situations that you wouldn't think a process would be able to span. And I think the reason for that is there are two things we're working on here. One, yes, we're bringing in systems thinking and system dynamics and the artifacts and processes from that to help get our heads around the complexity of the thing. But that's been done for about 60 years now, and it hasn't really taken off. The thing that we've added through Emergent Impact is the deeply human side of the equation. And that's largely due to my time as a trauma psychotherapist, a developmental psychotherapist, my training with Yvonne Agazarian in system-centered group psychotherapy, and even my time as a rolfer. That really embedded in me a strong sense of what it means to be more fully human. So if you understand what it means to be more fully human on one end of the spectrum and how complex systems operate on the other, you can largely sort of dial yourself along that spectrum to find the optimal blend of the principles, the practices, and the processes that Emergent Impact offers to suit the situation you're in. So I think that's what accounts for that degree of success. Okay. This is a not so simple project. Now this, I chuckle and probably shouldn't because this is an incredibly tragic situation. This was the first set of really severe fires in California back in 2017. We've had even more severe ones since then, but this one was shocked California, and especially Sonoma County. You can see the numbers here about the degrees of impact and how it affected nearly 500,000 citizens. So they wanted to think through, how do we recover from this in such a way that we're poised for whatever might happen next. So that was the intent of the project. The beginning working goal was that we knew we wanted some percentage and proportional diversity. And what proportional diversity meant was based on actual population, the ethnicities, populations of different ethnicities. We wanted some sort of proportional diversity of Sonomans living an inclusive, thriving, and resilient quality of life by 2025. That's what we were seeking through this. Now, that eventually turned into an understanding that we wanted to be able to, in order to make this, positive and measurable and time specific, it turned into scoring 90 on the Social Progress Index by 2028. And I'll show you the specific subgroup out of which that arose in just a moment here. Okay, the general flow of Emergent Impact is to move from individual interviews and maps to subgroup meetings to an integrative map to a collective analysis in which both the people that participate in the process, as well as I, as the systems thinker component, I do a systemic analysis, they do the expert analysis. Out of that comes a set of levers that eventually combine to create a strategy map, and I'll show you examples of those. Now, when we talk about individual maps and interviews, we're looking for a 360-degree view of the ecosystem. So we're looking for opposing forces inside of the ecosystem to be sure that they're adequately represented and that the impact they have on one another is fairly represented. The subgroup meetings are the result of having done a 360-degree set of interviews and having mapped them and understood them. We realize that there are certain affinity groups in there in the system, and we want to bring those affinity groups, those like with like, together first, so that they can get clear before they begin to interact with one another in the sort of the less like with the less like groups. Those individual maps are then combined to create the integrated map, which I'll show you an example of in a minute. Then we do an analysis, and then the strategy map emerges. So let's move forward here a little bit. Some stats. We did 34 interviews and maps and attended several group meetings to get a clearer sense of the whole ecosystem. Out of that came 7 subgroups, so affinity groups. You might think of them that way. And the final strategy summit attracted 65 leaders, which was far more than we had anticipated. We thought we might get 20, but we had an overwhelming response to the desire to come together to begin to solve these problems at a countywide level. Now, this is an example of an individual map. I'm showing you this one because, well, first of all, let me say what the point of the individual map is. Number one, it has to add value to the person you interview, both in the interview by asking sort of pivotal questions. And if you know how to model, you'll know the kinds of questions to ask because you'll start to understand what are you looking for that makes up a successful system at a micro level, individual system. The second thing you're trying to do is to get a good read, a rigorous read on an aspect of the ecosystem so that you can reflect it in the integrated map. In this case, this was Keith, and Keith was he was the executive director of, I think it was the Sonoma County Home Builders Association, or maybe it was the North Bay Home Builders Association. But at any rate, he was overseeing the organization of home builders responsible for rebuilding in Sonoma County after the fires. Now, Keith was subject to a lot of complaint about how come the housing wasn't being rebuilt faster. And through this interview, we discovered, by the way, this was his goal, was doing what we can do well, rebuilding our community by rebuilding the North Bay. So that was what he was about. Now, here's the real jewel in the whole map was immediately following the fires and the devastation, builders in the East Bay of the Bay Area all promised, hey, don't worry, we got your back, we'll be there, we'll help you rebuild. Well, over a year had passed and there had been no rebuilding. And people were really quite upset about it. Housing was already a problem in Sonoma County. Now it was even more of a problem. Wealthy individuals who lost a home, like say a doctor and his family, were displacing sort of people the next rung down on the economic ladder in order to get the doctor to stay in the community. That person was displacing the next rung on the ladder, which might be people working in the construction industries or the agricultural sector or whatever, but it sent this ripple effect in the community. It was very damaging to the community as a whole. And Keith was looking for a way to be able to explain that, and this created that. And here's how that worked. You have to understand the builder business model. Now, in the East Bay, the business model is very different. There's a whole building proximity. That is, you're building a tract housing, usually in a confined, well-defined geographic area. The workforce is very close by. If you have an electrical issue in a house, 2 doors down, well, the electrician is only 2 doors down. He can run down, fix that, come back, and continue his wiring of this house, or a plumber, the same thing. So the workforce was close by. The places were close by, and then also, by the way, materials could be sited in a common area. So it made for great, great, building scalability. You could get a lot done in a little bit of time, relatively speaking. The sites were uniform. It was either like all flatland or all hilly. It was all forest or all prairie. It was that uniformity allowed you to design houses that would work in those different environments. And you could then scale that and you could get these economies of density in that case. And that gave you the building scalability. Now, as you're able to scale, you're able to raise the profitability because the scalability lowered the unit cost, which increased profitability. But it also brought down the cost per unit. So anyway, it worked out for everybody. Well, unfortunately, in Sonoma County, that's not how the housing rebuild needed to happen. Different houses burned in different places. They were scattered throughout. It wasn't like, in some cases, yes, the whole area got wiped out. But in most cases, it was sort of hot spots, burned places up, burned up buildings, burned up houses. And so there wasn't scalability. There wasn't, the kind of site proximity. There wasn't, uniformity. They couldn't get those economies of density in there, so they couldn't bring the cost per unit down. Therefore, the good faith promises made by the builders in the East Bay couldn't be honored because it didn't fit their business model. They would go broke trying to do that. Once Keith understood this, he had a way to talk intelligently and caringly, compassionately with people about why this wasn't happening faster. Now, there were other issues around housing that pre-existed the fires, but this one specifically touched on why the damage from the fires wasn't being addressed more quickly. So it added a lot of value to Keith, as did the other 30 or so maps that we did based on the interviews that came out of that. All right, so that's an individual map. The beautiful thing about individual maps, by the way, is in addition to adding value, coming to understand the system, is it gives each individual that you interview a little primer on systems thinking. Now, by the way, I don't ever use the word systems thinking when I'm talking to clients. I just say, how do you get your head around all that stuff? Something like that. So by walking Keith through this map, he came to understand how a systems diagram works without ever being told that it's necessarily a systems diagram. It's just his world. That prepares him well, primes him well for the larger, more complicated map that comes along. All right. Now, once we've done a bunch of these, as I told you, we came up with 7 different affinity groups, 7 different subgroups. There was a subgroup on economic development that you see here. There was a subgroup for labor. There was a subgroup for community. There was a subgroup for education and workforce. There were 7 different subgroups. And what we do with each of these is we use a tool called a behavior over time graph. So the behavior here is this goal, which is a code right now for social progress index that I talked about in that earlier ago, that 90 on the social progress index by 2028. So what their goal was the social progress index plus resiliency. And that's the goal. And now the success is represented by a score of 90 by 2028. But failure is the status quo and declining, which you'll see these lines here are declining. So this is the behavior we're concerned about here. And that's how is that behavior flowing over time? And time is down here. So here's the day. And we ask, well, how far back do you need to go to understand what's happening to this goal over time? And they chose 2010. It was 2019, I think, when we were doing this work. And so when we go back to 2010, now this is a more complex behavior over time graph. We usually have just one of these black lines and then one of these green lines. But in this case, the social progress index for the Sonomans fell into 3 clear quartiles. It's not quartiles, it would be terciles, I guess. There was those in what we would consider the lowest economic rank, and then the mid rank, and then the highest rank. And if what we did for each of these, we said, well, where in 2010 was the lowest rank on a scale of 1 to 10 relative to our goal of 90 by 2028? And what's going on here is you're running your cursor up and down the slide, and you're before you've even drawn these lines. And you're saying, so where was this in 2010? Was it up here? No. Was it here? No. Lower here? And finally somebody says, no, it's right there. And you say, what has you say that? Now, here's what's critical about this and what it enables. We're looking for a fact versus an opinion-based conversations. Opinion-based conversations get us in real trouble. Well, I feel like, or I believe, or I imagine. That's not reality-based. And when I said reality-based, by the way, about the goal, reality-based is this factual accounting of where is this thing going over time and where does it need to go in order for this goal to have any chance of success. And this gap between where it's headed and where it needs to go is the reality of the situation. It's just a math. Now, how we're going to get there is what the whole project is about, but this is the math of the reality for this particular portion of the population. All right, so now that you say, okay, well then from there, does it go up? No. Does it go down? No. Does it go, what does it do? Well, it goes pretty steady. And so this Andy Lopez thing was a tragic police shooting of I think it was a 13-year-old boy who was carrying an airsoft gun, and the police mistook it for a real gun and shot him. It's a real tragic story. And then there were some elections that kept things sort of subdued and tipped it to starting down. And then the fires hit, and they really took a hit. This lowest tercile really took a hit. And then because of the family flight, it looked like it was going to get worse and worse and worse for this group because the economic conditions were going to worsen in Sonoma County because of the flight due to housing in many ways. And so each of these groups, by the way, had similar things where there were every time someone wants to announce a change in the trajectory of the slope of the goal for this particular group, they need to give us a reason why. And so you can see here that in 2010 there were still foreclosures going on, and then businesses were closing. But then the economic recovery began to happen, and people got more hope. But then the housing losses came from the fires, and then rebuilding and insurance money began to flood into the community, which started to lift the economy. At any rate, once you get to this point, you ask them, okay, this is the system. You're a part of the system. You're doing smarter and smarter projects. You're hiring better and better leaders. You're raising more and more money, and yet this is still happening. What's likely to happen going forward if something significant doesn't change? And that's when it gets fairly somber. For this, set of people, it was going to get significantly worse fairly quickly. For this group, it was going to go for a while and then taper off because the cost of housing was going to be really bad. And then for this group, the aging workforce was going to mean that the quality of life in this social progress index, which includes health and some other things, was going to begin to deteriorate. So then you ask this question, well, then what must happen by when in order for this goal to have any chance of surviving and thriving? And so for each of these groups, if they wanted to get to a level of, score of 90 by 2028, well, then they had to get up to a 9 on a scale of, 10 here, and they needed to converge so that it would be an inclusive community. Now, this gap became there's an energy that gets generated when you do this with a group. The first bit of the energy is that they all align on a goal. When they came in the room, and they weren't aligned on a goal. In this room, we had people from the social services sector. We had people from the Chamber of Commerce. We had people from education that wanted to participate in this particular group, people from the workforce. So they were all coming from a different place. But when they aligned on this goal of social progress index plus resilience, their energy went significantly up. Then when they began to confront what reality was looking like for these different economic groups, and it was a fact-based understanding of reality, their energy went up even more. And then when they saw what had to happen by when, and that they all agreed on that, because there's another thing about this is I don't talk about consensus. But when you're working with reality, reality is the determiner, and it's fairly stable in certain regards. And so it causes a convergence toward a consensus, I guess is the best way to say that. So people had all this energy in their systems because they were forming their own set of relationships and trust and understanding in the context of a very worthy goal. So this gap between where it's going to go and where it needs to go is there's a significant amount of energy there. And the question we ask is, what's the state of being you must inhabit in order to close that gap? And you get these amazing statements from people about, oh, I think in this case it was radically compassionate. It was also revolutionary. There were a bunch of very high energy statements, and we save those words and we bring those words back to the group when we need to, if and when they begin to falter a little bit, because these are long-term projects to do what they want to do, and it requires sustaining energy over time. All right, so that's a subgroup, and that's a behavior over time graph. Now, this is the integrated map. This is the as simple as possible, but no simpler. In this case, this is as simple as I could get it to make sure that everybody felt seen and heard, understood, and included, appreciated and included. Now, I put this little statement up here that it's not about the map because people think the map is the point of the whole thing, and the map is an essential artifact. You have to have it in order to be able to align the groups around a common outcome, to recognize all the I won't say competing, but all the interdependent needs in the system. In order to do the analysis, you need to have this map to be able to find the leverage points in the system. So it's really about the conversations the map enables. And the map is simply a necessary artifact for that. Now, at the bottom, I say these three questions. And what I mean by that, and we announce these questions to people before we start to tour the map so that they'll keep an ear out for that, an eye out for that. The three questions we ask are, one, is this your whole world, all of its bits and pieces, and the relationship of those bits and pieces? And that's important to make sure that we've got a whole system. And so we work the map until they can answer that question. And the second question is, does it explain why you're experiencing what you're experiencing today? And can you see how you could experience what you're seeking in the future? And in that sense, it's like the human body. This body can lay on a couch and eat chips and watch TV, or it can compete in a marathon. It's the same system. It's a function of the strength of the different resources inside the system, VO2 max or body fat or whatever the important criteria are for what you really want to do with that system. The third question is, do you see yourself in here or the issue you care about? Because if you don't, well, there's two problems. One, the map is incomplete. And two, why would you play? There's nothing in it for you. So we make sure we answer all three of those questions before we go into the analysis stage at the end of this whole process. But let me just give you a sense of the map without getting into too much detail. This was the working goal that got refined down to 90 by 2028 on the Social Progress Index plus resilience. And in order for that to come about, then the first thing was the quality and quantity. There's a legend to this map of the Social Progress Index decision. And that decision is about the design of decisions, the making of decisions, and the enforcement of decisions. Now, the design had to do with the fact that many of these public hearings weren't really open to the public because they were held at times and in places that people couldn't get to because they had jobs or they had kids that needed childcare or whatever. So some of the most important people to have in the conversation weren't even able to attend. Now, once that input is gathered, then how do you make that decision? And is it made thoughtfully and with the whole in mind, or is it made based on special interest groups? The enforcement was important because a lot of decisions get made and they never get carried out. So all three of those things had to be able to happen. And in this case, what we had, oh, by the way, this is what's called a stock flow diagram. This is the other enhancement to the process since the early work in Guatemala and with REAP in the Midwest. A stock flow diagram, this is a quantity of something. So this is the quantity and quality of this kind of decision making. And so it's like an inventory that goes up and down. Now what raises it is including people, and what lowers it is excluding people. And as you can see, there's a whole set of forces that have a motivation to exclude. And there's a whole set of forces that have a motivation to include. And there's a lot of detail that goes into this. So we want to boost the including side and dampen the excluding side is the idea here. All right, so let's say the decisions are made now. Now the question becomes, okay, then how do we innovate? This is the quality and quantity of inclusive, resilient, thriving, and sustainable innovation. Because we're going to have to take those decisions and then get them enacted somehow. And they typically require innovation. And then there's innovating and obsoleting of the inflows and outflows. Then the percentage and proportional diversity of Sonomans affordably housed. So that was the number one problem, was housing. And we can either shelter people or we can expose them, which is what homelessness does. It exposes people to the elements and to crime and to certain kinds of risk. Now, once they're in a house, then we can ensure that they're safe and secure. That safety and security is a prerequisite for being able to make sure that they're healthy. And then that health is a prerequisite for being able to work, to be able to earn a thriving wage, not just a living wage, but a thriving wage in this case. And education is included here, by the way, as a prerequisite for being able to, whether it's vocational or other kinds of education. Then once we have that in place, then we need to be able to have the kind of mobility required to get people around. Now, by the way, I'm saying this in a linear fashion only because it's all happening simultaneously. Please don't misunderstand, but we can't talk about it all simultaneously, so we have to lay this thing out. The arrows are about the simultaneity of it. So this mobility and access is critical. It included things like even like telecommuting here as one of those. Then we have to have discretionary time and opportunities, because you can't work all the time. It's not healthy. Your creativity falls, your emotional and familial and social well-being tanks. So that's critical. And then, of course, we had to have wealth. Everybody wants to be able to own a home, send their kids to college, plan for retirement, take vacations, that sort of thing. So wealth was critical. So those are the elements required to bring about this goal. Okay, and we ran a lot of people through this map. We ran through each of those 7 subgroups. I forget how many dozens of people then grilled this map until we knew we had it right. Once that was right, then we did an analysis, and here's where that surprise I promised comes up. This is the strategy map, and these are the elements that came out of the analysis. And as you can see, this represents 6% of that total map. Now, that's the promise of systems thinking, is that if you understand the whole, you can identify those acupuncture points if you were an Oriental medicine doctor, or you can diagnose and prescribe the right medicine or the right treatment if you're a traditional physician, let's say. You can pinpoint it and then resolve it. That's the promise of systems thinking. So in this case, it distills out of that huge complex map of over 250 variables, again, of which I'm not proud, it's just necessary, down to 6% of that. Now, here's what the surprising part was. Here you could see a little more clearly. Over on the left here is that section from the decision-making section, the SPI decision-making. And I won't go into too much depth here. These are requirements. I want to get to that surprising piece. This is where the surprise came in. The quality, quantity, and inclusiveness of childcare was the number one lever in the whole system. And that stunned us. And then we thought about it and went, oh my Lord, if you have childcare, you can go to work. If you can have childcare, you can go to school and get an education if you're needing one, whether it's vocational or otherwise. If we have good quality childcare and it's highly inclusive, then children will be raised in a healthy way. They'll be raised physically and cognitively healthy. They'll be raised socially and emotionally healthy. And that's a prerequisite to being a contributor to society, as opposed to being a drag on society. So that made complete and total sense once we saw it, but we all agreed we never would have seen it had we not gone through this kind of a process and had it emerge out of that system based on the structure of the map and the kind of we have people circle parts of the map and stuff like that to pick levers, but it was a systemic view of the map that got us that. Okay, and in fact, Lisa Carreño, who's CEO of the United Way of the Wine Country, took this on as her organizational charge, one of the many that they handle there in Sonoma County. Okay, so that was how that unfolded. And in fact, it's still going on today, even though this work was done in 2019. I got a call within the last 6 months because one of the participants, Oscar Chavez, he became head of the Sonoma County Foundation, which is a very large foundation that distributes the money in service to many of these levers here. And they asked again for renewed copies of the map so they could begin to deepen the implementation of this. So it's very encouraging that that's still alive there. Okay, now this is what accounts for, this is what's really going on here sort of under the hood. We are creating relationship and clarity at 6 organic levels to evoke these capabilities. And let me explain this a little bit to you. When I was asked after I did the origin projects of this over 20 years ago in Guatemala, with Care Guatemala, and in the Midwest with REAMP, a renewable energy alignment and mapping process around climate change. I was asked to teach at Care Guatemala in Atlanta. And so I had to put together something to explain to them what were we doing. And I knew that we were consciously building, level by level by level by level. And I knew that the most important thing was to create good relationship in the beginning, and then to get to clarity about what was really going on in physical reality. Now, this relationship side is all of the psychological, the humanistic, the personality-based kind of understandings to get into good relationship with people. And that's based on my work as a trauma psychotherapist and a developmental psychotherapist, and my training in group psychotherapy with Ivana Gazarian and so forth. Now, the clarity side is all the systems thinking, understanding, and my time, as a businessman, my time running organizations, my time with venture capital firms, and as CEO and COO of startups during that time. That's sort of the clarity side. And by weaving these two things together, here's what begins to happen. Now, the easiest way to talk about this is in the negative. If I'm not in a relationship with myself and I'm not clear, you better not follow me because it's not going to be good. But if I am in a relationship with myself and I am clear about what's going on, that's the first time I can actually express good leadership. And at the level of another, if we're in good relationship and we have shared clarity, then we can develop trust. At the level of team, it's innovation. At an organizational level, by the way, team is subgroup as well. At the level of the organization, you form those to execute what teams and individuals can't do alone. At the market or constituency level, it's scalability. And at the ecosystem level, whether that's a business, a social, or an earth-based ecosystem, it's sustainability. So that's the framework. These are the principles here without going into depth about there. There's a similar practices grid that's just like this, but it has the practices inside of each of these boxes that are employed to ensure relationship and clarity at each of those 6 levels. That's been at the heart of the work for the last 20 years. And that's what has enabled its success in these many, many different environments. I want to show this slide because I want to be sure and touch on one other thing that I think is particularly relevant at this time on our planet. There's a guy named Jean Pajot who was the CEO of a Swedish pharmaceutical company, Pharmacia. And he said something like, leadership is the act of making a promise must be made, and then having to change in order to keep it. And I realized, every leader I've shared that with in the last, 5 or 6 years since I discovered it, has been kind of, positively stunned by it. It's like, yeah. And for me, it's described how this work came to be in many, many ways. I remember, when I was having to deal with this when a psychotic was referred to my trauma practice, I didn't know exactly what was going to happen because I had no idea what was in their mind. But I did know that they somehow had to become better. So that's a promise that had to be made. And then I had to figure out how to change who I was and what I did in order to keep that promise. So there's a promise I'm currently engaged in right now, which is to train 15,000 practitioners how to do this kind of work at the 4 different levels of individual, team, organization, and ecosystem. And out of that, to create a global community of practitioners that are continuing learning and evolving this way of working. And I've even gotten funding from an impact investor to do this. So if you want to know more about this, either how you can be served by it or how you can serve through it, feel free to have a look at my website at emergentimpact.com. With that, I'll let you go. Thanks so much for your time and attention. Take good care. Bye-bye.